It's hard enough being a successful author of fantasy or science fiction, but more impressive, putting out great novels in multiple genres. I've got a top 10 list here of such authors today. How many of them will you have read? Welcome to Fantasy for the Ages, the show where a father and son talk about fantasy, science fiction, horror, and other nerdy things we enjoy. I'm Jim, the father of this show, and glad to have you with me here today as I talk about some pretty amazing authors. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. So, being an author, there's a ton of people trying to do it. There are many being fairly successful at it. And then there are some that are incredibly successful, racking in the bucks, and have yachts and mansions. Those are the outliers. But even harder to reach are the ones who can have big hits, bestsellers across genres. Not just be a science fiction star, or not just be famous for your fantasy, but instead be able to give you a hit in here and here and here. All these different styles of writing, different genres with different tropes, different styles, different audiences. There are people who love a good mystery who won't touch science fiction, and yet some authors can appeal to both crowds. This is unique and not an easy thing to do. I've done some research here thinking about the authors that I've enjoyed and which ones have been able to be successful in multiple genres, bring out a totally different style for a different audience, and sometimes the same audience, people who like variety. And I have a top 10 to share with you today. Now, these are the top 10 fantasy and science fiction authors that I'm familiar with who have successfully crossed genres. I'm sure there are more, but these are the ones who have attracted my interest. And either I've read and enjoyed their works, or their books are high on my TBR and I look forward to reading them soon. Everything I've heard about them tells me I'm going to love them. Let's get into the authors and see what I came up with, and I'll be interested to see how many of you agree with. Number 10, the bottom of my list, is Brandon Sanderson. Brandon is one of the biggest names in fantasy fiction these days. He's got so many bestsellers now. He says a book's coming out, people are going to buy it. He broke Kickstarter, for goodness sake. Didn't even tell people what the titles would be ahead of time. You know, he had his debut novel, Elantris, back in 2005. He's got Warbreaker, another standalone that people loved, the Mistborn series, the Stormlight Archive. He's got some really big hits, but those were all fantasy. I'm talking cross-genre people. Well, he actually writes some pretty decent science fiction, too. One of my favorite novels of Brandon Sanderson is The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. That was back in 2023, one of his secret project novels. The other three were connected to his Cosmere. This one was just a standalone, fun, little quirky sci-fi novel, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Other things he's done in sci-fi, Legion, back in 2014. It's a series, but the one in 2014 was book 2, Skin Deep. That's the highest rated of his Legion books. We've got Steelheart, which is the start of a YA science fiction series, The Reckoners. I've read all of that. And then he's got his ongoing science fiction YA series, Skyward, which is also making waves. Got a lot of fans. Brandon Sanderson's number 10 on the list because, honestly, fantasy is his thing, and he dabbles in some other stuff that has also been fairly successful. Number 9, China Miéville. I haven't read any of China's stuff yet. His books look great. They're on my TBR. I'll be getting to some of them this year, hopefully. But he's dabbled in a whole bunch of things. We've got Kraken, which is urban fantasy, a standalone novel. Embassy Town, which is solidly science fiction. Then we've got The City and the City, which is crime fiction, also classified as weird fiction. So he goes in these bizarre directions. And then there's the Baslag series, 2 books out already. A third is coming soon. This is what he's most successful with, and what I'm going to probably read first, I think. Perdido Street Station was the first book, and The Scar is also out. I mean, just great stuff that doesn't matter. He's gone all over the place with these different genres, and he's making waves. Number 8, an author who's been around a bit longer, Octavia E. Butler. Octavia has gone ahead and done a variety of things. They all tend to have some leaning towards science fiction, but very different subgenres and even stretching a little beyond. Fledgling came out in 2005 and is a sci-fi fantasy blend. Then you've got Kindred, all the way back in 1979, which was sci-fi historical fiction. 1993 saw The Parable of the Sower, which is a dystopian sci-fi novel. And The Parable of the Talents, book 2 of the same series, the Earthseed series, was in 98, even more successful than the first one. And then 1980, Wild Seed was out there, which was another sci-fi fantasy novel. Octavia Butler has shown her chops. She can write a variety of books. They all have been bestsellers that I'm listing for you and are pretty highly rated at Goodreads. Number 7 on mine is Ian M. Banks. This is an author I have not read yet, but is highly praised by friends of mine, and I'm looking forward to getting to his Culture series, The Culture. This is a science fiction soap opera series that I think he's best known for. Many of the books, bestsellers, very popular, but he's done more. And the variety is pretty cool. A Song of Stone, literary fiction with a war theme. Dead Air, which is a thriller. Wit, which is a satire. The Bridge, which is fantasy. And The Crow Road, which is mystery. All these different types of fiction, and he seems to thrive in each element. So while The Culture is going to be the top of what he does and what he's probably always going to be best known for, these other books show, hey, I can write all kinds of genres. Number 6 on the list is Piers Anthony. Piers Anthony is one I've known for a long time because of his long-running and still being written Xanth series, a comical fantasy series with over 40 books out. Some people don't think much of Piers Anthony because of Xanth. It's not a series necessarily with a lot of depth. It is with a lot of humor. And some people find it offensive. Doesn't necessarily, the older books especially, didn't fit with today's modern culture. But he's done some other great things. Refugee, a science fiction novel. Split Infinity, more sci-fi. Cthon, sci-fi. On a Pale Horse, sci-fi. Macroscope, science fiction. Okay, there's all these very successful books he's done in the sci-fi lane while just kind of churning out these Xanth books for the fun of it. These are not the same lanes that he's writing in, and they're not the same audiences at all, and yet he's been very successful. Number 5, Orson Scott Card. Now, this is an author that we typically think science fiction. People go, Ender's Game, and yeah, there's a whole series of Ender's Game books. The Ender's Saga, but there's more. 1999, he put out Enchantment, which was a standalone fantasy novel. 1987, we go back farther, we've got Seventh Son, book 1 of the Tales of Alvin Maker, which was an alternate history fantasy novel. And there are multiple books in that series. Very successful, highly rated on Goodreads. You thought he was only sci-fi? Maybe you should check out his fantasy books. Number 4 on the series, Margaret Atwood. Now, I have not read a Margaret Atwood yet, but my son Zach has, and very much enjoys what he's read so far. So I've got Atwood's books on my TBR. And there is no one lane for Atwood. I found The Robber Bride, which is psychological drama fiction. The Blind Assassin, which has elements of historical fiction in it. Alias Grace, which is historical fiction. The Handmaid's Tale, which is dystopian fiction and probably what she's best known for. And there are multiple books in that series. So she's demonstrating a real talent at writing fiction with depth, Some of it more historical, some of it more fantastical, dystopian. All of it good. Number 3 on the list, Michael Crichton. Now, this is an author that has passed away. We will get no more Michael Crichton books, but we got a ton of really good ones over the years. And he's best known for his science fiction techno thrillers. Everything from the Andromeda Strain to Jurassic Park. But he wrote more. Eaters of the Dead, all the way back in 1976, was an historical fiction adventure. Airframe and Disclosure were thrillers that weren't sci-fi. Rising Sun, which was made into a pretty interesting Sean Connery Wesley Snipes movie, was a crime mystery thriller. And The Great Train Robbery, 1975, just historical fiction focused on a crime again. So, Michael Crichton, yeah, he's got those techno thrillers, the sci-fi leanings, but there's more to what he put out. And a lot of it is very highly rated and were bestsellers. Number 2, Ray Bradbury. Now, Ray's been gone for a while here now, but some amazing books that he put out. Listen to this variety. We've got Something Wicked This Way Comes, which was a fantasy horror novel, just delightful. It's actually book 2 of a series, Greentown. Dandelion Wine was book 1. People don't talk about that one, but it's a series. Fahrenheit 451, which is dystopian sci-fi. The Book Burnings. Then you've got The Illustrated Man back in 1951, straight science fiction. And of course, The Martian Chronicles in 1950. Wonderful science fiction. The Martian Chronicles is what he's probably the best known for, but Fahrenheit 451 is pretty well recognized, and Something Wicked This Way Comes. People have heard these things. Ray Bradbury, very talented writer. But number 1 on my list, still an active author, very prolific, so many different genres he's been able to touch on. I'm talking about Stephen King. Everything from his debut novel way back in 1974, Carrie, which was horror, but also with a heavy psychological drama element. Fairly quickly followed by The Shining, which is horror of a supernatural ghost style. But then we've got Misery, which is a thriller. Elements of horror, but it's really more a thriller. Much more recently, in 2011, we had 11/22/63, which is straight science fiction with some leanings into historical fiction. And have you read The Green Mile? Fantasy because of its fantastical elements, also tied to crime. It's not horror. Not at all. It's a very moving story. And we've got things like Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, Stand By Me, The Stand. So much variety that Stephen King's put out. And I didn't even mention The Dark Tower, which in and of itself is epic fantasy, horror, Western, and science fiction all in one 7-set volume and a novella. Nobody has crossed genres as successfully as Stephen King. If you think I'm wrong, prove it and put down in the comments who's done more than Stephen King. I want to give a few shout outs, just a few extras that I didn't think were successful enough or had truly crossed genres enough to be in my top 10, but are worthy of recognition. One, and we've got longtime Patreon fan and friend Eric Hahn. He'll hate that I'm saying this one, but Mark Tufo. That's the zombie Fallout series writer that I so enjoy, and he's done a number of related series to it, like in Fallout, the standalone Demon Fallout, the Timothy trilogy. But he's also done Indian Hill, which has nothing to do with horror, nothing to do with zombies. It's a science fiction military series about alien invasion. And it's really good. Eric, it's really good like Zombie Fallout's really good. You still probably won't like it. But those of you who are fans of Tufo and you haven't touched Indian Hill yet, go read that series. You'll find it very entertaining. Then we got V.E. Schwab. This is another author who's very talented in going in different lanes, but they all connect somewhat to fantasy, which is why I can't put her in my top 10. But we've got Gallant, which is a fantasy horror mashup, A Darker Shade of Magic, which Zach reviewed recently. That Shades of Magic trilogy, that's book one of, is straight fantasy with maybe a little historical fiction elements. Vicious, book one of the Villains series, is fantasy sci-fi blend. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I've got a review out on that one, is a fantastical historical fiction novel. So many different things, all fantasy somewhat, but with very different feels and styles. So Schwab is one of these that's it's getting there, but hasn't totally let go of fantasy in anything she's written yet. And then I'll mention one more, C.S. Lewis. Now, that's a throwback author. I've been recently reviewing The Chronicles of Narnia, and 7 books, very successful fantasy tales. But he also has some very successful Christian fiction books that are still touching on fantasy. The Great Divorce and the Screw Tape Letters are a couple of examples, but they're not all in fantasy like the Chronicles of Narnia. They're trying to say something different, something more. But then this guy goes off and does a nonfiction book, Mere Christianity. It's theology. It's deep. He could really write. Everything that I'm giving to you here is related to the Christian faith in some way. It's an allegory, or it's actually just bluntly talking about Christianity. But whether he was going fantastical, semi-fantastical, or serious, he wrote well. You don't have to be some really sharp genius theologian to understand the points he's trying to make. So C.S. Lewis gets a shout out. So again, there's my novels that I wanted to share, the authors that I'm bringing to you today. These are authors who demonstrate versatility, skill at the art of writing. They aren't stuck in one particular lane. They can diversify. They can write to different styles and appeal to different audiences. And by doing so, they're even more popular than some authors out there because they've been able to hit different groups of readers. We don't all like the same thing. And I think it's pretty impressive when you can be great for this group, great for that group, but they'd never read each other's stuff, yet you all love the same author. That's a gift. That's amazing. What are some other authors that you'd say are really good at crossing genres? Even, again, one you might think is better than Stephen King? Put them down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd also like to hear what you think of these authors that I put out here today. Are you also impressed at their writing ability? Do you think their writing is garbage? Let me know. Let's discourse. I always love seeing the comments, and I will be sure to reply. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.